March 1889. By the third day of the wildfire, Sutter's flat was burning alive. The smoke had come first, a low yellow ceiling pressing down on the valley like a dirty hand. Then the wind shifted, and everything changed. Fences vanished in walls of orange. Barns became lanterns. The creek, that had always marked the eastern edge of town, ran low and brown after 6 rainless weeks, too shallow to matter now, too thin to stop anything. Families dragged furniture into the street and didn't know where to run. Men soaked blankets in horse troughs and held them against window frames until the water steamed away. Yet something strange reached the ears of people who still had the presence of mind to listen. A rumor passed mouth to mouth through the choking air. Up on the mesa, behind the Red Rock Formation, the old Navajo traders called the Broken Ear, a young woman's homestead, had not caught a single ember. Her fields were green, her cisterns were full, her root cellar was stacked floor to ceiling with everything a family needed to survive until October. Most people in Sutter's flat had spent the better part of 2 years calling her foolish. Her name was Vera Calloway. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a Colorado surveyor who had died of fever before she turned 18, leaving her a mule, a transit level, and a leather notebook filled with observations about wind, water, and terrain that most men her age hadn't thought to notice. She had read that notebook so many times the binding had split. She had memorized the margins, and when she arrived in Sutter's flat in the spring of 1887, with a land claim already filed and a horse named Cinder pulling a wagon of hand tools, she already knew exactly where she intended to build. Not in the valley, not near the creek where land was cheap and flat and obvious. Up on the mesa, behind the Broken Ear. The land agent, a compact man named Harold Fitch, had spread his maps across a pine counter and stared at her finger, resting on a section of red rock and dry grass that nobody else had touched. He looked up slowly. "That parcel sits 40 feet higher than the valley floor," he said. "No irrigation access, no established road. Wind up there will strip your roof before Christmas." Vera didn't move her finger. "That's precisely why I want it," she said. Fitch removed his glasses and cleaned them, which was what he did when he needed time to think. He replaced them and looked at her again. She was young enough that a few of the men waiting behind her exchanged glances. Pretty enough that a few of them smiled in the particular way men smiled when they assumed a woman had made a mistake she couldn't see yet. She noticed both reactions and said nothing. She paid the filing fee in silver coin and walked out into the afternoon sun. The talk started the same week. Before Vera Calloway had sunk a single post, Sutter's flat had already decided what it thought of her plan. The opinion spread the way opinions always spread in small towns, faster than verified fact, slower than the truth would ever catch up with it. Margaret Holt, who ran the dry goods store with her husband Dale, said it kindly enough. She told people that the poor dear had clearly inherited her father's stubborn streak, and that someone ought to write to a relative before winter set in and things got difficult. Clara Pruitt, who taught at the schoolhouse on Elm Road, mentioned Vera's claim during a lesson on land stewardship as an example of sentiment overriding reason. Even Reverend Oakes made a passing reference during a Sunday sermon about the virtue of accepting one's natural limits, though he did not name her directly. The harshest voice belonged to Thomas Aldridge. Aldridge owned the largest operation in the county, nearly 4,000 acres of bottom land with a proper irrigation channel and a house that had glass windows on 3 sides. He had built his wealth methodically and believed his judgment about land was beyond reasonable dispute. When he rode up to the mesa one afternoon and studied Vera's claim from the saddle, he didn't bother dismounting. "Young lady," he said, "I have spent 30 years learning this valley. Dry mesa land at that elevation catches every hot wind that comes out of the southwest. Come July, you'll be sitting on a skillet. Come drought, you'll be hauling water by hand from the creek like it's 1,840. He turned his horse without waiting for a response. Vera drove a stake into the ground and marked the next corner of her foundation. Not everyone who came up the Mesa Road arrived to criticize. Jonas Webb made the climb on a Tuesday in April, walking slowly on account of the leg he'd broken 2 winters prior that had never healed quite straight. Webb was Sutter's Flat's most experienced builder, a man who had framed houses, barns, and the Masonic Hall on Cedar Street. and who chose his words with the same economy he chose his lumber. He walked the perimeter of Vera's staked claim twice before he spoke. He pointed at the red rock formation behind her planned foundation. "That overhang faces northwest," he said. "In a southwest wind event, you'll get downdrafts off that face. They'll push smoke back into any structure you build directly beneath it." His concerns didn't stop there. The mesa's clay subsoil, he explained, expanded when it got wet and cracked when it dried. Post foundations in that kind of earth shifted seasonally. A frame built without deep footings would rack and twist within 5 years. The dry air at that elevation worked differently on timber joinery than valley conditions did. He had seen more than one high country structure pull itself apart from the inside. Vera listened to every word. She had her father's notebook open in her hands. She walked Webb to the northern edge of the site and showed him 3 things. First, the way the prevailing summer wind came from the southwest and deflected off the angled face of the broken ear, splitting around the site rather than pushing into it. Second, the old waterline staining on the rock face, which stopped a full 12 feet below the level of her planned floor, suggesting the mesa drained fast and clean after even heavy rain. Third, a series of shallow depressions in the caliche crust that she had mapped over 3 separate visits, each one corresponding to natural drainage channels that had been carrying runoff off this particular section of rock for longer than Sutter's Flat had existed. She wasn't fighting the mesa, she explained. She was reading it. Webb stood in silence for a while. He looked at the notebook, then at the rock, then at the young woman beside him who described water movement and wind behavior the way most people described roads they had walked themselves. "I still think those footings need to go deeper than you've marked," he said finally. Vera nodded. She had already planned to go deeper. She picked up her pencil and changed the notation in the margin. Webb left without another word. He came back the following Saturday with a post-hole digger and didn't explain why. The work began in earnest through April and May. Vera had planned it in stages, the way her father's notes described laying out a survey. Establish the fixed points first, then let everything else follow from them. The first fixed point was water. Before a single board was cut, she spent 2 weeks digging a cistern system into the bedrock shelf at the base of the broken ear, 3 chambers connected by clay-lined channels, designed to collect and hold every drop of rainwater that ran off the rock face during monsoon season. The chambers were covered and sealed against evaporation. By the time the last lid was set in place, Jonas Webb had stopped offering objections and started offering observations, which Vera found considerably more useful. The second fixed point was the root cellar. She dug it herself, mostly, with occasional help from a 16-year-old named Oscar Reyes, who lived on a neighboring claim and had attached himself to the project with the quiet loyalty of a person who hadn't yet decided whether he admired her judgment or simply found the work more interesting than his own. The cellar went down 8 feet into the mesa bedrock, lined with flat sandstone slabs that Vera split by hand with a cold chisel and a hammer. Shelves followed. Ventilation channels came next, small angled cuts in the stone that moved air without letting heat enter. At the back, she packed a foot-thick layer of dry grass between the sandstone and the outer clay wall, the same principle her father had used to keep a survey camp supply tent cool through a Colorado summer. Nothing about any of it looked impressive from the road. Together, the pieces formed something. The house itself went up in June, a compact, carefully framed structure, positioned not at the exposed edge of the mesa, but set back 12 feet from the rim, using the broken ear's angled rock face as a windbreak on the northwest side. The roof pitch was steep enough to shed debris, but not so steep that it caught full wind load. Webb, who had returned so many times by now that his tools had simply taken up permanent residence in Vera's wagon bed, suggested a double-board exterior wall with an air gap between the layers. Vera had already sketched it. They argued briefly about the gap width. She won. Word of the construction reached Sutter's Flat weekly, carried down the Mesa Road by Oscar Reyes and occasionally by Webb himself, who had stopped describing the project as a curiosity and started describing it as interesting, which for Jonas Webb was essentially enthusiastic praise. Thomas Aldridge rode up a second time in July and stayed longer than he had the first time. He walked around the framed walls without speaking. He studied the cistern caps and the root cellar entrance. He looked at the rock face, and the windbreak line, and the roof pitch, and the double-board exterior. Then he looked at Vera. "You've got a water storage system for a desert homestead," he said, "on a mesa where the rain might not come for 4 months running." "Yes," said Vera. Aldridge put his hat back on. "What happens when it doesn't fill?" she told him. She had calculated the minimum catchment needed to fill 2 of the 3 cistern chambers from a single average monsoon event. She had cross-referenced her father's regional rainfall records going back 18 years. She had a secondary plan involving cinder and 2 large barrels if the monsoon ran short 3 years running, which the records suggested happened roughly once every decade. Aldridge listened to all of it. He said nothing when she finished. He rode back down the mesa road without the smirk he had arrived with, and that absence was the closest thing to a compliment Vera had yet received from him. One person never said a word against it. Eleanor Marsh was the postmistress and unofficial record-keeper of Sutter's flat, a quiet woman in her 40s who had been in the valley longer than most of its buildings, and who had seen enough boom predictions and collapse warnings to trust neither very quickly. She delivered Vera's mail herself on the last Friday of every month, making the mesa climb on a gray mule that clearly resented the whole arrangement. She never joined the conversations in the dry goods store about Vera's chances. She never smiled at the mountain fool jokes, which had become a reliable source of amusement around the feed store by midsummer. She simply arrived, handed Vera whatever letters had come, and looked around at whatever stage the construction had reached. On the August visit, she studied the cistern caps and the root cellar entrance for a long moment. She asked Vera one question. "When did you first decide this location was the right one?" Vera told her. Eleanor pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket, wrote something in it, and climbed back on the gray mule. She did not explain what she had written. Summer deepened. The work continued. The jokes continued alongside it. Across town, the new names for Vera had been refined through repetition. Mesa Mole was the most popular. Dirt Duchess had a brief run. The most cutting one, used mostly in the Aldridge circle, was simply the Burrow Girl, a reference to the root cellar that seemed to confirm, to everyone who used it, that she had given up on real homesteading and was simply digging herself underground to hide from the reality of what she'd chosen. Vera heard all of them. She was splitting sandstone for a drainage channel at the time. She kept splitting. Autumn came with one serious problem. She noticed it on a Tuesday morning in late September, when she pulled open the root cellar door and found the south ventilation channel dripping condensation along its lower edge. The channel was designed to move air. Instead, warm daytime air was meeting the cooler cellar stone at a point where the airflow slowed, and moisture was collecting in the gap. A small thing, easy to miss. She didn't miss it. She left the cellar and walked the mesa edge for a while with her notebook, working through the geometry of it. Then she came back and told Oscar, who had arrived that morning with his post-hole digger and a look on his face that suggested he already knew something was wrong. They took the south channel apart over the next 4 days. Vera extended the angle of the drop and added a drainage point at the lowest section, a small stone-lined pocket where any condensation would collect and evaporate rather than run along the channel wall. When they reassembled it, she covered the entrance with a hinged wooden flap that could be closed during the hottest part of the afternoon, when the temperature differential was worst. She waited through the following week. No condensation. She wrote one line in her notebook that evening. System holds. First test passed. What she did not write, but thought about for most of that night, was that a problem she hadn't anticipated had arrived, and she'd solved it before winter made it dangerous. Her father's notes had said something about that once, buried in a margin note about a survey camp that had flooded twice before they understood the drainage. A good design, he had written, is the one you keep correcting until the land stops surprising you. The land had surprised her once. She intended to be ready when it tried again. By late October, the homestead was finished. Vera began keeping records the same week, organized in columns on the left side of her ledger. Outside temperature at sunrise. Outside temperature at sunset. Cistern levels. Cellar temperature. Water used from storage. On the right side, the same figures for comparable homesteads in the valley below, gathered from Sutter's Flats Weekly Gazette and from Eleanor Marsh's quiet fund of accumulated observation. The comparison was stark from the first week. The Mesa homestead ran cooler in afternoon heat by 8 to 12 degrees. The cistern system held consistent moisture through dry spells that dropped valley wells by a foot in a single fortnight. The root cellar maintained a temperature that kept root vegetables through heat spikes that were rotting stored crops in valley barns. Almost nobody in Sutter's flat knew any of this. One exception climbed the Mesa Road on a cool November afternoon. Eleanor Marsh arrived on the gray mule, accepted a cup of coffee, and spent 40 minutes reading through Vera's ledger from the first entry to the most recent. She didn't offer an opinion. She compared numbers from one column to the other, with the focused quiet of a woman doing arithmetic she already suspected the answer to. When she finished, she closed the ledger and set it on the table. She looked out the window toward the valley below, where the first thin smoke from morning fires was rising into still air. She said nothing else. She rode home, but on the following Friday, she came back and read the next week's entries. She made that trip every week through the winter, without being asked, and without explaining herself to anyone in town. Meanwhile, the dry season that followed had been growing longer than usual for 3 consecutive years, a fact that Vera's father's regional records had flagged as a pattern worth watching. The monsoon in 1888 had come 6 weeks late and left 3 weeks early. The grass on the valley slopes had gone yellow by August. The creek had dropped to its summer low in June, a full month ahead of schedule. The signs that another year like it might be coming were not dramatic. They were subtle, the kind of thing a person needed to be paying attention to notice. Vera had been paying attention. In late February of 1889, she made the ride into Sutter's flat and asked to speak with Thomas Aldridge. He received her in the front room of his house with the glass windows on 3 sides. He listened for several minutes without interrupting, which was more than she had expected. When she finished, he sat for a moment. Then he said, "This valley has had dry years before." Vera agreed that it had. He said, "We've always managed." Vera said, "The last time the pattern ran 3 years consecutive, the Salinas settlement to the south lost half its livestock and abandoned 3 homesteads. That was 1874. It's in the land office records." Aldridge said nothing for a moment. Then he said the thing that powerful men often said when they didn't have a ready answer. He said she might be right, but that right now there was no proof of anything, and he couldn't reorganize 4,000 acres of operations on the strength of a young woman's notebook entries and her dead father's survey records. Vera thanked him for his time and left. She delivered the same information to Mayor Clarence Boyle, to Dale Holt at the dry goods store, and to Jonas Webb, who listened in full and then stood quietly at the edge of his lumber yard for a long time, looking west. By the time she rode back up the Mesa Road, the sun was setting behind the broken ear and turning the rock face the color of old copper. She put Cinder in the shelter and began moving her stored grain further from the entrance of the cellar and deeper into the coolest section. She checked the cistern levels. She adjusted the ventilation flaps. She was not hoping she was wrong. She already knew she wasn't. March came in dry. April was drier still. The creek dropped earlier than anyone had ever recorded. Grass that should have been knee-high by the first week of May barely reached a boot top. The sky stayed hard and blue and brilliant, and completely empty of anything useful. People watered their gardens twice a day and watched the water level in their wells drop by inches, then by feet. In the first week of June, a dry lightning strike hit a dead pine stand on the ridge above the Aldridge South pasture. By morning, the fire had found the grass. By afternoon, it had found the valley. The wind drove it from the southwest, exactly the direction Vera had marked in her father's notebook as the prevailing summer wind corridor for this section of the territory. Fences burned first, then the dry grass margins around barns and sheds that nobody had thought to clear, then the barns themselves. In town, Dale Holt and 2 of his neighbors spent 3 hours on his roof, with wet burlap beating at sparks, while the building next door turned into a column of fire, and the one after that followed it. The church lost its steeple. The feed store at the south end of Cedar Street burned to its stone foundation. Families who had water hoarded it. Families who didn't ran for the creek and found it too low to matter. On the mesa, Vera stood at the rim and watched. The broken ear deflected the southwest wind exactly as she had known it would, splitting the airflow around her site and leaving it in a pocket of relative calm. Embers that the wind carried across the valley rose and floated and fell, but the angle of the mesa rim and the stone face above meant they descended on the north side of her homestead, away from the structure. She had cleared a 40-foot band of dry grass around the entire perimeter in April, not because anyone told her to, but because she had looked at the year's conditions and done the arithmetic. The cisterns were full. The cellar was stocked. The house stood quiet inside its ring of cleared earth, while the valley below sent smoke signals in every direction that the land had not been listened to carefully enough. On the second day of the fire, figures appeared on the Mesa Road. The first was Margaret Holt, who arrived on foot, leading 2 children and a goat, her dress singed along the hem, and her face carrying an expression Vera would remember for the rest of her life. Not shame, not apology, just exhaustion and the particular look of a person who had run out of other options. Vera opened the door before she knocked. "Come in," she said. "Put the goat in the shelter with Cinder. There's water in the first barrel on the left." Thomas Aldridge arrived the following morning. He came on horseback, alone, the bay gelding dark with sweat and one foreleg favoring slightly where a burning fence rail had caught it. He dismounted in the cleared perimeter and stood for a moment looking at the homestead. The cisterns, the stone-faced root cellar entrance, the house sitting clean and intact behind its windbreak. He removed his hat. He had done that, Margaret Holt told people later, before he said a single word. For a man like Thomas Aldridge, in a county where everyone knew Thomas Aldridge, that was the whole story in one gesture. "I misjudged," he said. Vera asked if his horse needed water. Aldridge said yes. She showed him the trough. They didn't speak again for a while, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which surprised both of them. Jonas Webb came that afternoon with his wife and 2 of his grandchildren and a box of carpenter's tools he had carried 3 miles through smoke because he couldn't bring himself to leave them. He looked at the house frame, then at the double-board walls, then at the ventilation design above the root cellar. He set his toolbox down. "I'd like to measure things," he said. "When this is over," Vera said, "take your time." By the third day, the cleared perimeter around the homestead held 22 people. Vera's cellar fed them. Her cisterns gave them water for drinking, for the animals, for the wet cloths they hung over the shelter entrance to keep the worst of the smoke out. Eleanor Marsh had arrived on the second evening with her gray mule and her notebook, and she had begun recording names the moment she walked through the door, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had always suspected she would be doing exactly this. Oscar Reyes organized the firewood. Margaret Holt organized the food. Aldridge, who was accustomed to being in charge of everything he stood near, found himself following a 26-year-old woman's instructions about rationing water and felt only gratitude. Clara Pruitt, the schoolteacher who had used Vera's claim as a lesson in sentiment overriding reason, sat near the cellar entrance on the second evening with 2 of her students on either side of her. She looked at the shelves stacked with root vegetables and dried beans and sealed grain jars. She looked at the stone walls and the ventilation channels and the systematic organization of a person who had been preparing for this exact situation for 2 years without being certain it would ever arrive. She said nothing that evening. The following morning, she asked Vera if she would be willing to come speak to the school when the town was rebuilt. Vera said she would think about it. The fire burned for 6 days in total, losing its force on the 4th day when the wind finally turned and the southern mountains sent down the first real moisture anyone had seen in 8 weeks. By the time it was done, Sutter's Flat had lost 11 structures, a significant share of its valley livestock, and a considerable measure of its confidence in the assumptions it had been building on. The Mesa homestead had lost nothing. 22 people walked back down the road over the following days, each one carrying something from Vera's cellar that she had pressed on them. Seed packets, dried provisions, a jar of honey, a bundle of dried herbs. She would not be thanked with empty words if there were useful things available instead. Thomas Aldridge was the last to leave. He stood at the cleared perimeter edge and looked back at the homestead for a long moment. "That cistern design," he said. "Could it be built on valley land?" Vera told him it could be adapted. The principles transferred. The specific form would need adjustment for lower elevation clay soil and different drainage gradients. She could sketch it for him if he wanted to bring his land manager up to discuss the site conditions. Aldridge looked at her. He had the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental. He said, "I'll send him up Monday." She said, "Bring a shovel." It's easier to understand when you're looking at the ground. He almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but it was closer than she had ever seen from him. Several weeks passed before Sutter's flat found the words it wanted to say. The rebuilding was slow, and the summer was long, and the conversations that needed to happen between people who had been wrong and the person they had been wrong about had a way of getting postponed when there were practical things to occupy the days. The moment that mattered didn't come in a formal setting. It came on a Wednesday evening in late July, when Eleanor Marsh sat down at the table in Vera's kitchen with both ledgers open, in front of her, Vera's and her own, and a lamp burning between them. A handful of people from town were there. Jonas Webb, Margaret Holt, Oscar Reyes, leaning in the doorway with the particular expression of a young man who understood he was watching something worth remembering. Eleanor turned pages without speaking for a while. The comparison was visible in the columns without any interpretation. 2 years of Vera's recorded figures against 2 years of valley conditions. Cistern levels against creek levels. Cellar temperatures against valley storage temperatures. Firewood used against firewood used. Then the fire columns. Every figure from the 3 days before, during, and after. The Mesa Homestead's numbers barely moved. Nobody in the room spoke. Arguments had very little ground to stand on next to columns of figures collected with patience over 2 years, without drama, without trying to convince anyone. The numbers hadn't been kept to win a debate. They had been kept because Vera's father had taught her that observation was only as useful as the record you made of it. Eleanor closed both ledgers and left her hand resting on top of them. For the first time, she said, the discussion can be about something real. It was the most she had ever said in one sitting. Across the room, Jonas Webb was looking at the ventilation channel above the root cellar entrance, with the focused attention of a man already solving a different version of the same problem in his head. He turned to Vera. "Would you mind if I sketched the dimensions?" She handed him a pencil without answering. He understood that as a yes. The following year, Sutter's flat began to look different in ways that were difficult to point to directly. 3 new homestead claims were filed on the sheltered eastern mesa slopes. A communal water cistern was dug at the edge of the lower valley, designed by Jonas Webb using principles that any visitor to the Broken Ear homestead would have recognized immediately. The new land guidelines that Clarence Boyle eventually pushed through the county land office encouraged settlers to consider prevailing wind, drainage gradient, and existing natural windbreak before choosing a building site. It was the first time such language had appeared in any official document in the territory. Nobody called it the Vera Calloway method. She would not have wanted them to. Thomas Aldridge hired a water engineer in the fall and oversaw the installation of a mesa-side cistern system on his south quarter. He never directly credited what he had seen at the Broken Ear. But when the engineer asked where he had first encountered the concept, Aldridge was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A young woman up on the mesa worked it out before anyone thought to ask her." The engineer wrote something in his notes. Vera stayed on the mesa for the rest of her life. Oscar Reyes eventually took the claim adjacent to hers and became a builder of some reputation in the Southern Territory, known especially for his work on water-efficient, high-elevation structures. He kept a copy of her father's notebook, at her insistence, telling her it belonged to anyone who would use it. Eleanor Marsh continued making the Friday climb on the gray mule until the mule finally declined the arrangement one morning and couldn't be persuaded otherwise. After that, she walked. She was 61 years old and made no comment about it. The schoolhouse at Elm Road eventually added a unit to its fall curriculum on practical land reading, introduced by Clara Pruitt, who taught it herself, and brought her students to the mesa once a year so they could stand at the Broken Ear and see how a person who paid attention to what the land was already doing could find within it a kind of shelter that no amount of argument had been able to build. Years passed. The territory changed. Sutter's flat grew beyond recognition and then settled into something steadier, less raw, more permanent. Storms came. Dry seasons returned. The valley adapted slowly, the way valleys do, carrying forward in its building habits and its water management the accumulated thinking of someone who had been dismissed as the burrow girl, while she was quietly learning how to survive everything the land intended to throw at it. When Vera finally died, Many years later, in the same house she had built behind the broken ear, with Jonas Webb's help and Oscar Reyes's labor and her own relentless, patient attention to what the wind was doing and where the water went, Eleanor Marsh organized the small memorial service. The marker was a piece of sandstone from the mesa edge, cut and dressed by a stonemason who had learned his trade from Webb. The inscription was not long. She did not argue with the land. She listened to it. Below the mesa, the valley held the shapes of the lessons she had left behind in it. Water moved through channels that remembered her cisterns. Buildings stood in positions that remembered her windbreaks. The broken ear caught the afternoon sun and threw its long shadow eastward across the Homestead site. The same shadow it had thrown for 1,000 years before she arrived and would throw for 1,000 after. The wind still came from the southwest in summer. It still split around the broken ear the way she had known it would from the first afternoon. She stood there with her father's notebook and felt the stillness in the air on the sheltered side of the rock and understood, with the quiet certainty of someone finally standing in the right place, that the land had always been holding this answer. It simply needed someone willing to stop talking long enough to hear it. Vera never shouted louder than her critics. She simply kept her ledger and kept her shovel moving. There's something quietly freeing in that. You don't need the room to believe in you before you begin. Pay close attention to what the land beneath your feet is already telling you. Do the patient work. Keep honest records of it. And let the evidence speak when the moment finally arrives. The truth has a way of outlasting any nickname. A small note for you. This story was imagined and written by AI, crafted to entertain you while leaving behind something genuinely useful to carry into your own life.